Lieutenant Kare lay motionless, half buried in the rubble of the shattered battlefield, her consciousness ebbing with each shallow breath. Her body was battered, armor scorched and cracked from the blast that had torn through her squad. Kare could still hear faint echoes of the battle's end in her mind, the roar of explosions, the flash of plasma rounds slicing through the air, and then the eerie silence that followed, broken only by the fading footsteps of her comrades leaving her behind. They hadn't hesitated. The rules were clear in her culture: strength was prized above all else, and weakness was unforgivable. Injured soldiers were an inconvenience, an embarrassment. To return home without the full strength of her species would only shame them all. She tried to cling to that notion as the cold seeped into her limbs, a final reminder that her people were never meant to show vulnerability. But the bitterness stung as the truth settled. She had been abandoned, discarded as if she were no more than one of the broken weapons strewn around her. The ground beneath her felt unforgiving, its chill biting even through her thick skin and armor. She shifted, groaning softly, each movement causing sharp jolts of pain to ripple through her. Breathing itself felt like a battle, the agony of each inhale reminding her of cracked ribs and bruised lungs. In the silence, she almost welcomed unconsciousness, an end to the throbbing pain and the raw humiliation gnawing at her pride. Then, faintly, she caught the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. At first, she thought it was her people, returning in a rare act of mercy. But as the shapes approached, she realized they were different. The silhouettes against the pale moonscape were smaller, slender, moving cautiously, almost timidly, toward her. Humans. Kare grimaced, the disdain rising in her even in her weakened state. Humans were notorious in the galaxy for their empathy, an odd and impractical quality that other species regarded as weakness. They were often referred to as soft, an insult that encapsulated their need to nurture, to help, and their inclination to protect even when it meant putting themselves at risk. Pathetic, she thought bitterly. And yet, here they were, approaching a stranger from a species known to be hostile to them, hands raised in non-threatening gestures, moving closer as though she were some wounded animal. One of them, a man with a soft voice that belied the seriousness in his eyes, crouched down and carefully examined her injuries. He muttered something to his companions, who all wore expressions of worry, their brows furrowed in concentration. Kare barely managed to keep her eyes open, the pain making her vision blur, but she was keenly aware of their presence. She wanted to spit, to tell them she didn't need their pity, but even speaking was beyond her strength. The humans didn't wait for permission. They worked quickly and with surprising precision, pulling out rudimentary medical kits and making do with their limited supplies. She felt the sting of disinfectant, the pull of bandages across her wounds, each touch efficient and unhesitating. Even in her anger, a part of her marveled at their willingness to dirty their hands, to risk themselves for someone they barely knew, from a species known for cruelty toward weaker beings. "This is absurd," she finally managed to croak, her voice a hoarse whisper. The human tending to her gave a soft, understanding smile, but he didn't stop his work. "You're going to be all right," he said, his tone as gentle as it was resolute. The words stung worse than her wounds, stirring an irrational anger deep within her. She didn't want his softness, his pointless optimism. And yet, as her strength waned, she found herself oddly comforted by his presence, by the steadiness in his gaze. She hated it, and yet, she clung to it. They began to move her, carefully lifting her as though she were some priceless, fragile thing. Kare bit back a groan, the pain nearly overwhelming, and yet none of them faltered. Their faces were set with a kind of determination she couldn't understand. They were strangers, she was nothing to them. And yet, they carried her as if she were one of their own, as if her life mattered to them. They reached a small outpost, its metal walls battered and rusted but radiating a warmth she hadn't felt since the battle. They set her down gently inside, and Kare felt the exhaustion wash over her, dragging her toward unconsciousness. Yet the last thing she saw was the human's face, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't fully comprehend, a mixture of worry and kindness, emotions her own people would have scorned as pathetic. As her eyelids grew heavy, Kare's mind wrestled with the contradictions swirling within her. These humans, these so-called weak beings, had risked themselves for her. They had lifted her from the battlefield, ignoring her snarls and insults, treating her wounds with a level of care she hadn't experienced even among her own kin. She had been taught to see them as lesser, as fragile creatures whose compassion was a weakness. But as she drifted into sleep, one troubling thought refused to leave her. In this moment, these humans were stronger than anyone she had ever known. Kari woke to the sound of low voices, the steady hum of machinery, and the sterile scent of disinfectant in the air. Her vision was still hazy, but she could make out the shapes of the humans moving around her, discussing something in hushed tones. She scowled, feeling a sharp ache in her side where their medical devices had left new bandages. The thought of relying on their strange, primitive equipment stirred up a fresh wave of resentment. One of them, the man who had spoken to her earlier, noticed she was awake and approached with a cautious but friendly smile. "You're healing up nicely," he said, his voice calm and soothing. His tone was maddening. He spoke to her as if she were a fragile creature, a lost animal in need of care. She glared back, wanting to push him away, but her body betrayed her, too weak to muster even a simple protest. "What do you expect in return?" she rasped, her voice filled with disdain. "Why would you help an enemy?" The human didn't flinch at her question. Instead, he shrugged as though it were a simple matter, a basic truth he accepted without question. "It's what we do," he said. "We don't leave people behind, no matter where they come from." The words unsettled her. Kari's people valued independence, a fierce self-reliance that left little room for compassion or empathy. Here, weakness was despised. But these humans were different. They treated her injury not as her failure but as a challenge, something they were determined to overcome together. She wanted to scoff, to tell them their kindness was meaningless, but a part of her, buried deep, was strangely moved. Days passed, and the humans continued their efforts to help her heal. Every time she woke, they were there, tending to her, speaking softly, giving her water, feeding her. They were patient, as if her hostility were just another wound to be treated, something that might eventually heal with time. She resisted them at first, snapping whenever they got too close, holding on to her contempt as if it were armor. But they never responded with anger. Instead, they met her scorn with understanding and an unfailing determination to help her recover. One night, as she lay awake, unable to sleep due to the dull ache in her side, the man sat beside her and began to talk. He spoke of his home, a world Kari had never visited, where cities rose up like mountains, filled with lights that glittered even in the darkest hours. He told her of his family, how his sister worked as a healer, how his mother had taught him to cook. His words painted vivid images in her mind, strange and unfamiliar scenes of warmth and connection. "Why tell me this?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "What do your stories have to do with me?" The human tilted his head thoughtfully. "I just thought you might want to know who we are. We're more than just strangers or enemies. Maybe that doesn't matter to you, but to us, it's important." Kari turned away, pretending indifference, but his words lingered. No one in her species would share such personal details, especially with an outsider. Connection, for them, was a rare thing, reserved for the very few who proved themselves through strength and loyalty. But here was this human, offering her a glimpse into his life with a kind of openness that felt alien, even unsettling. She felt herself wavering, as if a door she had long kept shut was inching open against her will. Over the next few days, she allowed herself to observe them more closely. She noticed the way they worked together, the ease with which they moved around each other, helping, laughing, teasing, all things her people saw as distractions, as weaknesses. Yet these humans were anything but weak. They were resilient in a way she couldn't understand, holding on to their compassion and kindness even in the harshest conditions. One evening, a young woman among them came over with a small device, something she called a translator. She gestured for Kari to try it, explaining that it would make communication easier. Kari resisted at first, unwilling to give in to their strange kindness, but eventually she allowed it, watching with curiosity as the human adjusted the settings. When she finally spoke into the device, Her voice came out clear, without the strained effort it usually took to speak their language. She looked up, meeting the human's eyes, seeing a spark of encouragement in them that was oddly comforting. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with genuine confusion. "I would not do the same for you." The woman didn't seem offended. Instead, she smiled, a simple gesture that held no malice, only sincerity. "Maybe that's why we're different. We don't expect anything in return. We just believe it's the right thing to do." Kari fell silent, her mind struggling to process the concept. For her, survival was everything. It was the defining rule of her existence. To sacrifice time, energy, resources for someone else's sake, especially an enemy's, seemed absurd. Yet these humans acted as though it were the most natural thing in the world, an unspoken law they lived by without question. As she watched them, Kari began to feel something shift within her, a strange warmth that crept into her chest despite her best efforts to resist it. She still clung to her pride, her disdain for their perceived softness, but bit by bit, her anger and scorn began to give way to something else, something unsettling and unfamiliar. One night, as she lay in silence, she caught herself wondering what it would be like to belong to a group like this, a group that valued each member not for their strength or status but for their humanity, their ability to care for each other. The thought disturbed her, yet it lingered, nagging at her like a wound that refused to heal. Finally, as days turned into weeks, Kari found herself speaking to them more openly, asking questions, even sharing fragments of her own story. She told them about her species' values, the strict code of honor, the pride they took in their independence. The humans listened intently, not with judgment but with curiosity and respect, as if each word she spoke were a gift. They never challenged her beliefs, never tried to change her mind. They simply listened, offering her a space to speak her truth without fear or expectation. It was in those quiet moments, sitting in their dimly lit outposts, surrounded by people who saw her not as a soldier or an enemy, but simply as a person, that Kari began to question everything she had ever known. The humans had no reason to help her, no obligation to treat her with kindness, yet they had given her everything: shelter, care, friendship. In them, she saw a strength that went beyond the battlefield, a strength that came from something she had always dismissed as weakness. And for the first time in her life, Kari felt something like shame, not for her injuries or her weakness but for the narrowness of her own beliefs, the rigidity that had once defined her. She still didn't fully understand these humans or their strange way of life, but she felt a pull toward them, a desire to understand, to know more. As she lay back, her gaze drifting over the small, humble space that had become her sanctuary, she knew one thing with a certainty she couldn't ignore: these humans, with their strange customs and unwavering compassion, had touched something within her that she had thought was long dead. And though she wouldn't say it aloud, she was grateful. Kari was almost fully healed when the calm of the outpost was shattered by a sudden, blaring alarm. Instantly, she felt the adrenaline surge, an instinct that had been honed by years of military training. The humans around her moved quickly, faces tense as they exchanged urgent words, checking their weapons and rushing to reinforce the outpost's defenses. She caught fragments of their conversation, the fear and resolve in their voices unmistakable. A rogue faction had arrived, drawn by the outpost's resources. They were heavily armed, and their reputation for violence was well known. Kari pushed herself up, her newly mended muscles aching but functional, a small thrill of purpose running through her. Her instinct told her to escape, to find shelter or flee, but then she saw the humans around her, gearing up for a fight they were clearly not equipped to win. Her eyes darted to the worn, makeshift weapons in their hands, tools modified for defense but never intended for full-scale battle. Despite their inadequate firepower, none of them looked ready to abandon their post. They were prepared to face the danger head-on, even if the odds were stacked against them. A surge of pride flickered through her, unexpected but undeniable. In her culture, retreat was a disgrace, but there was something in the human's determination that went beyond duty or pride. It was a fierce, stubborn loyalty, a drive to protect one another at all costs. Against every instinct she had, Kari found herself standing taller, the pain in her body fading into the background. She would not run. These humans had risked everything to help her, and now, it was her turn. One of the humans, the same man who had tended to her wounds, noticed her rising and moved toward her, a mixture of relief and surprise crossing his face. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice steady but laced with worry. "You're still healing." Kari met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I am a soldier," she replied simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps to her it did. Honor demanded she fight beside them, that she repay their kindness not with words but with action. She was not one to make speeches, not one to voice gratitude openly. But here, on this outpost, surrounded by these stubbornly compassionate humans, she understood that her strength could serve them as well as herself. The first strike came swiftly, a barrage of plasma rounds that exploded against the walls of the outpost, sending debris scattering across the ground. The humans ducked for cover, their faces grim but unwavering, already returning fire with their meager weapons. Kari felt a surge of anger, not directed at her attackers but at the thought of these people, these fragile, resilient creatures, being cut down simply because they lacked the firepower to defend themselves. Without hesitation, she moved to the front line, her body instinctively falling into the rhythm of combat. Her movements were fluid, precise, honed from countless battles, and the humans watched her with something that looked like awe. Kari aimed carefully, taking down the advancing soldiers with a cold efficiency. She could feel the energy of the fight flooding her senses, the familiar rush of danger mingling with the unfamiliar satisfaction of knowing she was protecting others, not out of duty to her species but from a strange, newfound loyalty. The humans fought bravely beside her, their lack of formal training compensated by sheer determination and an unspoken bond that held them together, even under fire. Kari noticed the way they covered each other, moving in sync, protecting one another with an instinctive selflessness that baffled her. She had fought in many battles, but never had she seen such camaraderie, such raw, unyielding commitment to one another's safety. It was as if every blow they struck, every shot they fired, was not just for survival but for each other. As the skirmish wore on, Kari realized how different this battle felt. For the first time, she wasn't fighting out of anger or pride, she wasn't driven by the need to prove her strength. Here, on this isolated outpost, surrounded by humans who had shown her kindness she had neither earned nor expected, Kari was fighting for something more. She felt her disdain for their compassion melting away, replaced by a fierce respect for their courage, for the quiet strength they drew from one another. At one point, Kari noticed the young woman who had helped her use the translator device earlier. The woman was pinned down, a rogue soldier closing in, plasma rifle aimed directly at her. Kari didn't think, she moved on instinct, lunging forward and intercepting the attack with a speed that surprised even her. The blast grazed her arm, the heat searing through her skin, but she ignored the pain, taking down the rogue with a swift, brutal strike. The woman looked up at her, wide-eyed, a silent gratitude shining in her expression. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that gaze, Kari felt a connection she hadn't known was possible. She had saved her not out of duty or expectation but because, somehow, this human had become someone worth fighting for. The realization struck her harder than any blow she had received, a truth that she couldn't deny any longer. She was one of them now, bound not by blood or species but by something deeper, something she had once thought was weakness but now understood as strength. As the attackers fell back, regrouping, Kari and the humans took a brief reprieve, catching their breath and tending to minor injuries. She observed them, these resilient beings who had faced down an enemy with little more than determination and loyalty. They shared quick, encouraging words, checking on each other, and for the first time, she felt a pang of something she could only describe as belonging. The fight wasn't over yet. The rogue soldiers rallied, preparing for a final assault, their numbers still formidable despite their losses. But Kari's resolve only grew stronger. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the humans, no longer thinking of them as soft or weak. They were her allies, her equals. They had shown her a new kind of strength, one she had never encountered in all her years as a soldier, a strength rooted not in individual prowess but in unity, in trust. As the final wave of attackers bore down on them, Kare fought with everything she had, drawing on every ounce of skill and power she possessed. She felt the humans beside her, their presence fueling her determination, their courage igniting something fierce and unbreakable within her. Together, they pushed back the rogue forces, driving them away from the outpost in a brutal, coordinated defense. When the last of the attackers finally retreated, Kare stood amidst the humans, battered but victorious. The silence that followed was heavy with relief, punctuated by the faint, shaky laughter of those who had survived. Kare looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride, not for herself but for these humans, for their indomitable spirit, their refusal to give up, even when the odds were against them. One of the engineers approached her, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude. "We wouldn't have made it without you," he said simply, his voice filled with an earnestness that left Kare momentarily speechless. She looked away, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. "You fought bravely," she replied, her voice rough but sincere. "I have never fought beside people like you." The man smiled, a warmth in his eyes that Kare recognized as pride, not just in her, but in all of them, in the bond they had forged through battle and survival. She realized, in that moment, that she was part of something greater than herself, something she had never thought she would find among these humans. As they began to clear the battlefield, tending to the wounded and gathering what little supplies they had left, Kare knew that this fight had changed her. She could no longer see them as strangers, as mere allies of circumstance. They were her people now, bound not by species or heritage but by something far stronger, the knowledge that, in the darkest moments, they had stood together, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to abandon one another. And for Kare, a soldier who had once believed in strength above all else, this was a revelation as profound as it was humbling. She had come to this place as an outsider, a wounded soldier left for dead by her own kind. But now, she was something else entirely, a part of this group, this family of unlikely warriors who had shown her the true meaning of strength. And as she looked out over the aftermath of the battle, she knew she would stand with them, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the days passed after the battle, Kare found herself caught in a strange conflict, one that went beyond the scars of the skirmish or the weariness in her bones. Physically, she was almost fully healed, but there was an unsettling tension within her that hadn't subsided. She couldn't shake the growing sense of attachment she felt toward these humans, nor the loyalty she had begun to feel for them. Her own people's return loomed in her mind, a reminder that she would have to make a choice. For a soldier like her, loyalty was clear-cut, her people first, honor above all. And yet, here she was, drawn to something that didn't align with any of the beliefs she had once held as absolute. The humans went about their daily routines, a mixture of maintenance work, repairs, and gathering resources. They'd taken hits during the raid, but their spirits hadn't dampened. They moved with an ease and purpose, working together without needing orders or hierarchy. Each person knew what had to be done, pitching in where they were needed. Kare observed them, noticing how they checked on each other, offering support without expecting anything in return. It was a level of trust and mutual respect she'd never experienced among her own kind. Her people saw comrades as rivals to surpass, allies to be relied upon only in the heat of battle, never outside it. But here, trust wasn't earned through combat or victory. It was a simple, inherent part of how the humans treated one another. One afternoon, as she worked beside a few of them on the damaged outpost wall, a message flashed on the small communicator she had carried since the battle. It was a distress signal, the faint but familiar frequency of her own people, growing stronger as they approached the moon's atmosphere. She froze, her breath catching, the signal an unmistakable reminder of who she was supposed to be. They were coming to retrieve her, to bring her back into the fold. Soon, her people would arrive, expecting her to return with them, to leave this human outpost and resume her duties as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She looked over at the humans working alongside her, unaware of the signal, completely absorbed in their tasks. She imagined leaving them behind, returning to her people and falling back into the rigid expectations that had defined her life. Her people would praise her survival, commend her resilience, yet none of it would matter, not after what she had experienced here. How could she go back to a society that had abandoned her without a second thought? A place where weakness was despised and loyalty was nothing more than a word. As the distress signal repeated in her ear, a young human nearby noticed her expression. He gave her a curious look, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but perceptive. She almost flinched, and used to such genuine concern, especially for something as trivial as her mood. But the human had no ulterior motive, no reason to ask beyond a simple desire to make sure she was all right. "I received a message," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "My people are coming to retrieve me." There was a moment of silence as the young man absorbed her words, and she could see the flicker of understanding in his expression. "Guess that means you'll be leaving soon," he replied, a touch of sadness in his voice, though he tried to hide it. Kare nodded, her throat tight. "It is expected," she said, struggling with the weight of the word. Her people expected her loyalty, her obedience. Returning with them was a matter of honor, of fulfilling her duty as a soldier. And yet, for the first time in her life, duty felt hollow, empty of the purpose it once held. The young man nodded thoughtfully, giving her a small, understanding smile. "Well, you know, whatever you choose, you've been a part of us here. I think that's worth something." His words hung in the air, their simplicity carrying a profound truth she hadn't fully grasped until now. They saw her as one of them, as more than just a soldier or an outsider. It wasn't something they demanded or required, it was something they offered freely, without reservation or expectation. As the day wore on, Kare found herself lost in thought, her mind torn between the duty she owed to her people and the connection she felt to these humans. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that loyalty to her species was paramount, that her time here was nothing more than a temporary alliance. But every time she thought of leaving, she felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss that gnawed at her resolve. Late that night, she found herself sitting alone, staring up at the stars, each one a reminder of the vast galaxy that had once felt so certain and predictable. Her people's philosophies had been her guiding light, a constant presence that defined who she was and how she lived. But now, that certainty felt like a prison, confining her to values that no longer resonated, that felt at odds with what she had come to understand here. The humans had shown her that strength wasn't about isolation, about holding oneself above others. It was about resilience, about standing together, supporting one another even when it was inconvenient, even when it meant taking risks. She thought of the moments they had spent tending to her wounds, the battles they had fought side by side, the laughter and camaraderie they shared without reservation. She had never felt this kind of bond with her own people, had never felt truly seen or valued outside her ability to fight. With the humans, she was more than just a soldier, she was a part of something greater, something that valued her not just for her strength but for her presence, her being. A thought crept into her mind, one she had tried to ignore but could no longer deny. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to return to a life where loyalty was conditional, where weakness was despised, where compassion was seen as a flaw. She wanted to stay here, among these humans, to forge a new path, one that embraced the strength she had found in their unity and empathy. Her people's arrival was imminent, but Kare had made her decision. She wouldn't return. She would stay here, not as an act of defiance but as a commitment to the values she had come to hold dear. It would mean forsaking her people's expectations, perhaps even facing their condemnation, but the alternative, leaving these humans, abandoning the bond they had forged, was a loss she couldn't bear. As dawn broke over the outposts, Kare felt a peace settle within her, a calm she hadn't known was possible. She knew the choice she had made would change everything, that it would shape her future in ways she couldn't fully foresee. But as she watched the humans greet the morning with their usual warmth and resilience, she felt a quiet certainty, a sense of belonging that transcended loyalty to any one species. When her people's ship finally appeared in the sky, Kare didn't flinch. She stood tall, ready to face whatever consequences awaited her. She had found something here that was worth fighting for, something worth protecting, and she would not abandon it. For the first time in her life, she felt truly strong, not because of the battles she had fought or the honors she had earned, but because of the connections she had formed, the people she had chosen to stand beside. And as the ship touched down, she knew that her life, her loyalty, and her strength had found a new purpose, one that she would carry with her, no matter where the future led. The hum of her people's ship reverberated across the outpost, its shadow cast long and dark against the morning light. Kare felt every heartbeat echo in her chest as she watched the ship descend. She wasn't sure what kind of reception she would receive, whether they would greet her with pride for her survival or shame for being left behind. But whatever awaited her, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The humans around her moved closer, gathering with quiet strength, forming a loose circle of silent support. The ship landed, its ramp lowering with a calculated hiss, and from its interior emerged a group of Kare's people, clad in the familiar, formidable armor of her kind. Their faces, sharp and expressionless, scanned the outpost, lingering briefly on the humans, but their focus quickly settled on Kare. She held their gaze, refusing to let any hint of hesitation betray her decision. Her heart pounded with a mix of apprehension and certainty. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that her next words would set the course of her life. The leader of the group, a high-ranking officer, stepped forward, his eyes cold and assessing. "Lieutenant Kare," he addressed her formally, the authority in his voice unyielding. "You have been located and are to return with us to be debriefed and reintegrated." Kare nodded but did not move. She could sense the humans watching her, their silent encouragement steadying her resolve. Turning to the officer, she took a deep breath, summoning the courage that had been building inside her since the humans had first found her on the battlefield. "No," she said, her voice calm but resolute. The officer's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise breaking through his controlled expression. She held her ground, unwavering, even as her words hung heavy in the air. "I am not returning." The officer's gaze hardened. "Lieutenant, you are a soldier of our people. Your duty is to serve and obey. You were abandoned for a reason, to test your strength, to determine if you were worthy of survival. And yet you have chosen to align yourself with these." He cast a contemptuous glance at the humans. "These lesser beings." Kare bristled at his words, feeling a surge of anger on behalf of the humans who had shown her nothing but kindness and compassion. "They are not lesser," she replied, her voice firm. "They are loyal, brave, and they did not abandon me when I was weak. They stayed by my side, even when they had no reason to." Her words seemed to surprise him, as though loyalty born from compassion was an incomprehensible concept. "These humans may have aided you, but their methods are not our way. Compassion is weakness. Dependence is disgrace. You are a soldier, Kare. You owe your loyalty to your people, to the code we uphold." Kare met his gaze with unyielding resolve, feeling the truth of her decision solidify within her. "I have upheld that code all my life," she said. "But I see now that there is strength in compassion, a strength I was taught to dismiss. These humans have shown me loyalty, trust, and courage of a different kind. They fight for each other, not because they are forced to, but because they choose to. That choice is more powerful than any code." The officer's face tightened, a cold fury simmering beneath his expression. "You are forsaking your people, your honor. You are choosing a life of disgrace and shame, bound to creatures who lack strength, who cling to each other out of weakness." Kare stood tall, her voice unwavering. "Strength is not what I thought it was. I was wrong to believe that independence and isolation were the only forms of honor. I have learned that true strength lies in loyalty to those who stand beside you, not out of obligation but because they care." She glanced at the humans, their quiet presence steady and encouraging. "I would rather stand with them, as an equal, than return to a life where loyalty is abandoned at the first sign of weakness." Her declaration hung in the air, a challenge that reverberated through the stillness. The officer's expression hardened, his face a mask of contempt. "So be it," he said coldly, the finality in his tone sharp as a blade. "You are hereby stripped of your rank and dismissed from our people. You are a disgrace, an outcast." Kari felt a pang of loss, the finality of his words sinking into her. She had spent her life believing in her people's values, upholding their code with unwavering faith. But now, as she stood beside the humans who had become her true comrades, she felt no regret. She met the officer's gaze one last time, a calm defiance in her eyes. "I am not ashamed," she replied quietly. "I am proud to stand with those who showed me what true strength is." The officer turned, his back stiff with anger, as he signaled for his companions to retreat. They ascended the ramp without a word, the ship's engines humming as it prepared to leave. Kari watched it rise, a bittersweet feeling swelling in her chest. She was no longer bound to her people's code, no longer part of their ranks, but she felt freer than she had ever been. As the ship disappeared into the sky, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the human who had first found her, the man whose quiet determination had changed everything. His gaze was warm, a proud smile breaking across his face. "You did it," he said simply, as if her decision had been inevitable. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the last remnants of doubt fading away. Here, among these humans, she had found a place where she was accepted for who she was, not just for her strength or her rank. In the days that followed, Kari settled into her new life at the outpost, embracing the routines and responsibilities with a sense of purpose she had never known. She worked beside the humans, learning their ways, sharing stories, forging bonds that grew stronger with each passing day. She became more than just a soldier; she was a part of their community, valued for her courage, respected for her skills, but most importantly, appreciated for her presence. With time, the outpost became her home, a place where she could finally let down her guard, where loyalty and compassion were woven into the fabric of daily life. She fought alongside her new comrades, defended their shared territory, and offered the same kindness and support they had once shown her. And in those moments she found a strength that went beyond any code, a sense of belonging that could never be taken away. Word of her decision spread through the galactic channels, rumors whispering of a soldier who had turned her back on her people's rigid ways, choosing instead a life of unity and compassion. Some regarded her as a traitor, others as a curiosity, but a few, a quiet few, saw her as something else, a symbol of change, of possibility, a reminder that strength and honor could take many forms. Kari no longer sought the approval of her former people. She had found her own path, one that honored the strength of loyalty, the courage of compassion, and the power of true connection. And as she looked out over the stars from her new home, surrounded by her human family, she knew that this was where she belonged, among those who understood that strength was not just about standing alone but about standing together, bound by a loyalty that transcended race, rank, or code.